Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for being here bright and early. I'm just checking my phone just to check to see whether President Trump has been tweeting at all about trade, but it's possibly too early even for him at the moment. He tends to get up about 4 a.m. and start tweeting. But this is obviously one of the critical questions facing the global economy at the moment, facing policymakers here in Asia and around the world. The question of the outlook for global trade, the prospects for what may come of the various trade agreements that the world has had over the last 50 years or so, the long, steady movement over the last 50 years towards more open markets, to more free trade, international agreements, more openness, does seem to be at least very much under challenge right now, if not in danger of going into complete reverse. And so I want to get a discussion going by my colleagues here on the panel. We've got a really, really good panel, and of course we do want to have questions and observations as well from the audience. We'll have time for that too. So let's introduce the panel, and I'm going to ask them each to make an opening statement. I'm going to ask them a question, which I hope will provoke some interesting observations. But we have a really, really distinguished panel, and I'm delighted to be here. On my far right, on your left, Christine Bien Chin, Dean of the School of International Service at American University here in Singapore. To my immediate right, Carlos Gutierrez, who's now chair of the Albright Stonebridge Group, but of course as a former Secretary of Commerce of the United States. To my left, Gil Kaplan, who's the current Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade at the US Commerce Department. And on my far left, your right, Frank Luntz, founder, CEO of the Luntz Group, a polling, public opinion and research group in the United States, who also spends a lot of time, and I bumped into him last night as he'd just been traveling all over Asia, talking about the big issues as relate to public opinion about trade, and indeed about trade and about policy more generally. So again, we have a very distinguished panel. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. I'm going to start, if I may, with you, Undersecretary Kaplan. As I said, this is very much the hot topic at the moment. We've got the President of the United States and an administration which is widely seen as being hostile to many of the trade agreements that the world has been undertaking in the last 20 or 30 years or so. Obviously pulled the United States out of the TPP, almost one of his first actions as president. Said some pretty hostile things about NAFTA, and we're obviously in the middle of the very late stages, I should say, of renegotiations with NAFTA. Has been critical of trade agreements with Korea, critical of trade arrangements with the European Union, and of course, most importantly of all, and as we wait to find out how this turns out, critical of US-China trade, and particularly of China. Before I come to you, actually, on these questions, we have a poll. I hope you all have managed to download the Milken Institute's Asia meeting app, so that you can vote in polls in all of these meetings. And I want to start just before I do come to you, because I think this will set up quite well, Undersecretary, your remarks and your response here. We have a poll, and if you could go to your app, please, and pull it out and get ready to vote on this. The first question we have, I don't know if we put it up on the screen. First question we have for you for the poll is, what will be the outcome of the current US-China trade tensions? You have 4 options here. I'm sorry, only 4. A, China will do a deal with minimal tariffs on either side. B, negotiations will drag on and current tariffs will remain in place. C, there'll be no deal and we'll get a steadily escalating trade war. And D, other, if you prefer other. So quickly vote and we'll see what you all think. It looks as though I would characterize that as kind of modified optimism, that we're not going to get a steadily escalating trade war, although 28% of you think we are, but half of you think these negotiations are just going to drag on and the broad tariffs that have been announced will stay in place. So thank you for that. And just secondly, again, before I come to Secretary Kaplan, second question for you is, will President Trump's trade policy, A, lead to a fairer global trading system. B, make no difference to global trade. C, damage US and global economic growth. D, other. Nobody shares the president's view that it will create a more fair global trading system. You still have time to vote if there are any of you out there who think it might. Vast majority think that it's damaging US and global economic growth, 81%. So, sorry to set you up like that, Secretary Kaplan, but your administration's policy is not getting a thumbs up from this audience, if I may ask you.
Well, I don't have the app, so I wasn't able to vote.
You would have, here we are. So there's at least one vote.
Is it one of those polls where you can vote as many times as you want?
No, it's the technology's foolproof.
But really, on almost all the agreements you mentioned that we, I think you used the word hostile, that we were hostile to, we have already begun renegotiating, and in some cases have finished renegotiating those deals to make them better for the United States, better for American workers, better for American manufacturers, and better for American companies. That's our job. That's what we were asked to do. If you look at the Chorus Agreement, we have already renegotiated that. If you look at NAFTA, we have a much better deal with Mexico now. We have 10 years of data protection. This is for biologics. In the prior deal, 0 data protection. If you look at Europe, just this week, I've been in Asia, so I'm not clear on all the details, but just this week we have begun consultations with the Congress under the Trade Promotion Authority to start talking about a new free trade agreement with Europe. In terms of China, we looked very hard at what's going on in China, and some of the practices were so detrimental to the future of the United States and the future of advanced manufacturing and high technology in the United States that we felt we had to act. One of the state-sponsored practices was computer hacking of United States commercial enterprises. And someone asked me, is that covered by the WTO? And I said, no one in their wildest dreams when we wrote the WTO, and I was involved, thought we would have to have protections against a state involved in illegal computer hacking, because we didn't think anyone who joined the WTO would approve and promulgate those practices. But what we have seen with China is, and this is what's covered in the 301, and this is why we have the tariffs, is illegal computer hacking, forced technology transfer, IP theft, and very unfair licensing practices. So when US companies go into China, as they're entitled to do and should be entitled to do, we should not have to give up our intellectual property or be subjected to computer hacking and other practices. And that's what we want to resolve. And I realize there's some pain in going through the process of solving these problems, but we think in the long run, it's the right thing to do for the United States.
Thank you, Secretary. I'm going to turn to Secretary Gutierrez, because he dealt with many of these trade issues that Secretary Kaplan's just talked about, Korea, China, TPP, obviously. And Secretary Kaplan has a point, doesn't he, that for all the fear and storm and stress in the world about President Trump's tweets and saying NAFTA's the worst agreement anybody's ever agreed to, that the world is cheating the United States, it's all terrible. It's classic negotiating tactics, isn't it? You set out a very aggressive position right at the start, and then you enter into negotiations, and whether it's Korea, whether it's NAFTA, whether it's maybe some of these issues, other issues too, but perhaps, and we'll still whether we're going to see this, maybe we'll get the same result with China, that China will move on all these issues that the US, that you and others have been trying to get China to move on unsuccessfully, let's be honest, over technology transfer and intellectual property rights and others, that this administration is actually having some real success where other administrations didn't. Isn't that right?
I don't believe we've seen the success yet. That doesn't mean it's not coming, or it doesn't mean that it won't happen, but I think it's too early. It's too early to tell what the outcome will be, and we need to be thinking now. And I noticed the question there was about whether we're entering a trade war. I think we are in a trade war, but we need to be thinking now, how does this stop? Will this decrease U.S. influence? What happens to U.S. influence in the future in the sense of countries being comfortable with an agreement with the U.S., countries feeling comfortable that the U.S. won't walk out of an agreement? What will China-U.S. relations be? Are we going to recognize that we have two business models in this world? Or are we expecting to change China? What happens to global institutions? Is the WTO still valid? Is it still effective? Are we dismantling a system? And if we are, with what do we replace it? So I think there are, we're in the middle of this, and it's very tempting to talk about tactics and what's happening and what happens next in 301 and 232. But let's look out and understand what the effects on the world will be. Last thing I will say is I disagree with your point of not making progress. We, in the Bush administration, which is my experience, we made progress. But it was a different philosophy. It was gradualism. And we were willing to do gradualism. I think this administration is taking another course. But every administration has made progress. It's a matter of whether it's fast enough and whether we think it is tangible enough.
Thank you, Secretary. Christine Chin, if I could come to you. If you give us the picture here in the region and talk a little bit about the concerns that people obviously have. Global trade has been so important to growth in this region in the last 20, 30 years. The extraordinary expansion of economies here has been driven heavily by trade. As you look, and Secretary Gutierrez, you just heard him say here, we're in a trade war. As you look at that, what does that mean for this region, for the broader economy too, if you like, but for this region that seems to have benefited so much from trade?
There are a few points I'd like to make following from your comments, Carlos. America emerged victorious from World War II, set the international rules for engagement. What we now see as, quote, weaknesses or appeasement on the part of America has been some of the costs of global leadership. That's one. Two, I would even, following Carlos's point, I would even step further back and go up 20,000 feet and say the trade war, if we can call it that we're in, obscures an even deeper fundamental restructuring of the economy and of life in general. What it obscures, as we talk about sending production out or bringing production back to home countries, one, the eventual costs up the chain. Two, even more important and even scarier than the trade war, is automation. The adoption of robotic technology, applications of artificial intelligence. What does it mean to the changing notion and practices of work? What jobs, assuming that we can bring jobs back stateside or to whichever country, those jobs will not look the same. And I know that this conference in part has been trying to get it on the table. But these two issues have ramifications for this region that has really grown prosperous in the last 2 decades. One, consider this. There are 7 million international migrants in the Asean region. Most of them are engaged in what we call 3D work, right? Low-skilled work that citizens don't want to do. Coupled with approximately 213 million youth in this region, the highest ever level recorded. If we don't work on and address the changing nature of work, we may have something coming that is much more massive with longer term ramifications than the so-called trade war.
Thank you, Christine, thank you. Frank, if I may turn to you, to give us the political context here. You study public attitudes, politics more generally. It's important to say, I think, that whatever people people's individual concerns about what President Trump may say or tweet or what he's doing, that there's not much question in the United States and to some extent around the world, opinions about trade and specific trade agreements have turned pretty negative. It is worth recalling that, while the first things President Trump did when he came into office was to immediately pull the United States out of the TPP, it's worth remembering that Hillary Clinton during the 2016 campaign had herself said that she would pull the United States out of the TPP, the very agreement that her own administration of which she was a part had been negotiating. So the political context in the last few years had turned pretty hostile to trade. Give us your overall take on, both in the United States and around the world, what's driving, what are the politics that are driving these attitudes towards trade, and how might they evolve in the next year or two?
Each of us, you started off with a tough beginning. If I can borrow this for 1 second. Before you did the poll that showed that everyone in here disagrees with his policy, he had said, "Thank you, Jerry, for the kind introduction." So if you notice, he did not actually read that here.
He's coming back to that, I think, in a minute. I'm going to give him plenty of reasons to thank me.
So there are two aspects that are happening, and it's not just in America, it's in much of Europe, not in Asia, but it's in much of Europe. And it's basically 50-50 between the people who feel forgotten, those that work hard, play by the rules, and feel that the system that they were promised just did not deliver for them, and they feel there's no one on their side. There's no one backing them, helping them. They get no government benefits, nothing at all. And then there are those, and I'm cleaning up my language because I know that Mike will be watching, because it's 2 Fs, forgotten or screwed. And those are the people who watch individuals collecting benefits from government and live in slightly nicer houses and are able to go out to eat. And these people can't. And they feel like government has punished them, that government made promises to them that it did not keep. And that's the anger that you see erupting in many countries in Europe now, and the anger that erupted in America in 2016. And you see it and you feel it. I don't see it in Asian countries. I've been in 5 countries. I don't see it. I don't feel it here. It may come. And the ramifications, it elected someone who one might have thought was not going to win. And it continues to reverberate because there is no answer to it. There's no antidote to it. I'm often asked the question, what kind of language would I use to address these people? Trump's used the language. Trump connected to them. And that anger that he shows towards the system is the anger that he has articulated towards Canada, towards Britain, towards Germany, France, China. And the challenge that I would put back to you and to the panel is that we've now opened up a wound. How are you going to close it up again? How are you going to heal it again when the American public doesn't want to? They actually want to have a temper tantrum. They want to shout about intellectual property theft. They want to shout about losing these factories because they don't know about automation. They don't know about innovation. They think China stole their jobs. So step number 1 is to empathize. Step number 2 is to educate. But that's not what's happening in American politics right now. It's the opposite.
Secretary Kaplan, you're welcome, by the way. But if I may, and I do want to, I know you want to, I want to ask you about the specific Indo-Pacific initiative and the regional issues that I know you've been dealing with. But if I may just come on to this point, and the point that Frank raises, or to develop a point that Frank raises. You talk about, you just said in your answer to my first question that actually the administration has renegotiated already some of these agreements in a way that benefits American business. I think one of the questions that people have, though, is what is to the benefit of American consumers? And there's a lot of concerns about this. This was said a lot over the steel and aluminum tariffs that were implemented. That was great for American steel and aluminum producers, but it wasn't great for anybody who wants to buy a car. Because it is, the United States obviously imports a lot of steel and aluminum for all kinds of things, and ultimately raising the price of those things actually ends up hurting the consumer. And more generally, there's always this phenomenon in politics that while the benefits of trade are very thinly and broadly spread across the whole country, across the whole world, people benefit from lower prices and easier access to more interesting products. The disbenefits of trade, the costs of trade, when a factory closes because it's been put out of business by cheap competition from overseas, that's very focused, very concentrated, very easy to identify. How are your policies benefiting American consumers?
Well, I think there are a few things. One is when you look at advanced manufacturing and the need for the United States to be at the top of their game in that, that will be a tremendous benefit for American consumers and deal with some of the issues that Christine raised. If we lose the ability to do that, we're going to be at the mercy, and all our consumers will be at the mercy of other countries, namely China, if we can't develop an artificial intelligence infrastructure, autonomous vehicles, even less high-end materials like semiconductors and computers, which we're losing out on entirely. Consumers are not going to have a strong economy with efficient and low pricing if we don't manufacture any of those products. I'd also say if you're talking about the 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum, the amount of aluminum, for example, in a can of beer is very, very low, and there is no impact ultimately on the price of that can of beer, similar to most other products that contain steel. These tariffs have had the effect of making people pay attention to the United States' concern about having a steel industry that can protect our national defense and an aluminum industry that can protect our national defense. But it has had no impact on steel-containing products or aluminum-containing product prices that I have seen. So we are very concerned about consumers. We haven't taken steps to, cut out products which are needed by consumers. We have a whole panoply of procedures by which companies can request exclusions from the tariffs if there is not availability in the U.S. That applies both to 301, the new tranche of 301 tariffs, and the 232 tariffs.
Christine, if I may, what's the connection here between, in this region again, but again more broadly perhaps in Asia, between trade and security, and how important is that relationship between the two? It was kind of interesting when we probably all, many of you I'm sure have read or had a chance to read excerpts from Bob Woodward's new book about the Trump administration. It's not fair to say a very favorable account. It begins with a story of Gary Cohn, the former president's chief economic advisor, actually literally physically preventing the president from signing a piece of paper that would have abrogated the Korea-US trade agreement. And Gary Cohn pointed out that this was absolutely critical. U.S. Good relations with Korea were critical, obviously because of negotiations with North Korea, but because of specific issues to do with intelligence sharing and everything else. So emphasizing that there is a really tight connection in many of these areas between trade and security. And obviously in Southeast Asia, that has been very important for the United States and its engagement with ASEAN over the last 20 or 30 years or so. Can you talk to tell us what might be the implications if trade is going to become less open and if the relationships are going to become less close? What might be the implications, the security implications for the United States and for this region?
Well, there's always been a connection between trade and security. I think the train has left the station in terms of turning inward, countries turning inward. If we take a broader view of security, the conversations, the debates, the tariffs, if we agree or not that there's a trade war, it affects human security. And I'm going to link it back to Frank's earlier point about US and Europe, what's happening there that's not been happening in ASEAN. At the turn of the 20th century, the welfare state came into being, right? Social security, unemployment benefits, access to health care. That came, the structure of the welfare state came as a buffer against the ravages of capitalism. It is to allow capitalism to continue. Let me link it to Carlos's point. When you upend that and you start withdrawing public subsidies, you don't have anything in place. In the early 1990s to 2000s, do you remember the anti-globalization protests in Seattle, for example?
Famously, yeah.
Right?
WTO.
Yeah.
Labor, human rights, environmental group. Then comes 2016. The groups that have been silent rose up and articulated. I'll suggest a slightly different perspective that draws the connection between these groups, as polarized as they are. What they're asking for is protection against the continued unfolding of capitalism. If the welfare state is going to be rolled back, what do we put in its place so that free trade continues? What makes this even more complex? I go back to my earlier point, the ABCs: artificial intelligence, big data, cloud computing, additive manufacturing, 3D printing. The 2018 is very different from 100 years ago, but we don't have the buffers in place. When you hear Bernie Sanders go on about democratic socialism, it's not socialism per se. It is in response to the decline of the welfare state. We don't have it here in ASEAN. I'll suggest one explanation. I'll link it to urbanization. Now, when countries, economies begin to industrialize, living the way we live our lives is horizontal, land, right? With the rise of cities, we live vertically. What does it do to family structures? What does rural urban migration do to the structure of extended families that have, over the course of decades and hundreds of years, have been the buffer for industrialization? Do you see the connections? It's not simple, it's really complex. But we live in a world where we can, so we think, tweet 140 characters and react and respond in 140 characters. It reduces the complexities of what we're confronting to 140 characters.
But what about, Frank, if I may ask you quickly, and I want to come back to Secretary Gutierrez too, what about, I think, national security or international security? How much does it damage US interests in terms, especially in terms of public opinion, your specialty, when, in terms of the kind of objectives it may have in defense issues, defense agreements, alliances, here in Southeast Asia, in East Asia too, how much does it damage the United States' ability to continue to have those strong alliances if the President of the United States is saying, we want a completely different trade arrangement, this is, you treat us unfairly, and we're going to put tariffs on your products? What does it do to the United States' ability to enjoy its international security arrangements?
I'm going to take the opposite. And you wouldn't know this, but we've looked at this issue, and you actually hit it perfectly. The number one issue when it comes to trade is the loss of jobs. By 2 to 1, the public now believes that more international trade leads to job loss rather than job gain. But the second strongest argument against trade, which I do not share, the second strongest argument is national security. The idea that we will have to depend on China to build the weapons that we will need to defend ourselves from China. And I had no idea. And we're doing this research, and that changed people's minds immediately. They thought it was absolutely insane that the US would have any kind of weakness because we didn't have the industries, because we didn't protect them. And once they came to that realization that we should be building our tanks, we should be building our planes, everything that we need must be here, and those industries need to be protected, I couldn't move them away. I couldn't make them free traders. So you all may be thinking about what Trump is saying. And by the way, it doesn't help when you have an argument with the Prime Minister of Canada. We can add all the arguments that the President's had. In the end, what frightens Americans the most, other than the chain link fence on that X factory, is the idea that we will be dependent on our enemies to produce the weaponry that we need to protect ourselves from them.
Can I add?
Yeah, please, go on. Yeah, go ahead.
You know, one of the main impetuses and arguments during the campaign was the jobs that were moving to Mexico and how disturbing that was, and pictures of the plants in Indiana. And I think it's absolutely remarkable that this early in the Trump administration, we have renegotiated the agreement with Mexico so that we will have a much better possibility of having a deal with Mexico, having a NAFTA-like deal. Could be NAFTA entirely if Canada comes in. But we have different rules of origin. For the first time in any trade agreement, we have some rules about the wage rates in Mexico. And we have all kinds of high technology products covered so that we can trade with Mexico, but there will be much less impetus for American factories to close their doors and move to Mexico. So I think we're really trying to solve these problems that Frank is talking about, at the same time trying to stay engaged in the world trade system.
Secretary Gutierrez, what's your view on this? I mean, you heard, again, what Frank and Secretary Kaplan said, that actually security of supply, if you like, is much more important than worrying about whether Japan or Korea are going to be upset if we get tough with them over their trade surpluses. It's much more important that we ensure that we have security of supply and we can have a good security relationship with them, even as we're fighting with them over trade. Do you agree with that?
Well, there's a strain of thought in the U.S. that says if we don't make things, we're not really a country. And that sounds very logical, and people really buy that idea. So that's sort of the thrust of we have to raise manufacturing. Reality is, as a country becomes more developed, their services grow and their manufacturing declines. Interestingly, in the U.S., manufacturing is approximately 12, 13% of GDP. What has been declining very rapidly it's declining steadily, is manufacturing workforce. That's down to about 8%. It's hard to say that that's because of immigration or trade, because the percent of manufacturing is still there. We're still producing. The issue is technology. So, and that's where, when you talk about national security, I'm not sure the issue is physical things, because we're buying aluminum from Canada. Canada's an ally. I don't think that's a big national security risk. The risk is hacking. The risk is cybersecurity. The risk is about technology. So I think we need to focus on what's coming at us and not so much what we left behind. I recall that when we were doing a free trade agreement ourselves, there were some public servants who were promising that they were going to bring textiles back to the Carolinas. I wonder if that's fair to tell voters, if you vote for me, your good old days from 30 years ago will come back, and we're going to bring back textiles. Is that realistic? So, my point is, and I think the point was made very articulate here, the issue, the opportunity is technology. It's not so much about who makes the steel or who doesn't. It's what is going to happen to jobs when we see this coming. And this is not here yet, because if you look at the productivity of the U.S. economy, it's actually very low. And what that tells me is that the promise of the future, artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, robotics, et cetera, has really not arrived. We can't see it yet in the numbers, but we know it's coming. And I worry that we have a focus on, too much of a focus on the wrong issue, whereas we should be focusing on how are we going to retrain millions and millions of people who run the risk of losing their job and totally being left out of the economy.
But even that phrase is a problem. When you use the phrase retrain and you talk to the workforce, they freak out because they spent their entire life working in one industry. They've got one skill, and retraining, re-educating, all those phrases scare the living hell out of them. I hold, and I'm on your side, but I hold corporate America, the global corporate community, responsible for this because they're not explaining any of it. The average person is not reading the Wall Street Journal. The average person.
I don't think that's true, Frank.
But can I?
And no,
I've agreed with everything you've said so far, but that's definitely not.
And I will tell you, when people ask me,
Our circulation's never been bigger.
when people ask me, well, because you learned how to jigger the numbers. When people ask me, what is
That's fake news.
I'm
ladies
going
and
to give you. I'm going to compliment you when people ask me, where do I go for my information? Because everyone has now taken sides. You're the publication. I don't go anywhere on television or radio. I go to the Wall Street Journal. And it's a privilege to be on this panel with you.
Oh, my goodness.
But the average person does not read the Wall Street Journal. The average person does not have that education level. And I'm begging the elites on this panel, because they don't trust us. If the average American, German, British, I don't care where you go in the world, South America, Asia, they think we're the problem, we're not the solution. So, Mr. Secretary, if we don't explain what is going to happen and use the right language, then they're going to turn on us, and this bad situation is going to get worse.
Let me just say, I totally agree with what you just said. It's very hard to make a trade argument on a national scale. It gets lost, it's somewhat abstract, and when you're talking nationally, you will have people in communities that have lost jobs will say, wait a minute, that doesn't apply to me. I think the responsibility is in the private sector, and it's company by company. And whether it's CEOs or plant managers have to explain to their employees, this is why trade is good. And if we lose trade, this is what happens to your job. This is what we know, that people who are engaged in trade make more than people who are not. But I think it's company by company, factory by factory. You can't make a national argument.
Then stop using the phrase human capital.
Okay,
I haven't said human capital.
Which is used at this conference. Every time we talk about human capital, we are putting a price tag on the average individual, and they resent that. They're not a price tag.
Talking about
they're a
people.
human being.
Okay, I want to come to questions from the audience. I do want to give Secretary Kaplan, though, one more chance, and Christine, too, if you like, because I know, Secretary, you're here in the region. If you could tell us what's important about this region and what the United States, what the Trump administration plans in terms of economic relations with this region. I know, you recently launched a significant initiative. Tell us, if you would, what the objectives of the Trump administration are in terms of a healthy economic relationship with Southeast Asia, with Asean, within the Indo-Pacific, if you would.
Well, the reason I'm here, which is the Indo-Pacific region, and I was in India, then Vietnam, and now here, I met with the Vietnam Prime Minister, I met with the Trade Minister here and in India. We've had some very good discussions. It's really two or threefold. One is to indicate the United States is here, and we are here to stay. There is a great concern throughout ASEAN and Asia that we do not see our interests as that critical here anymore. That is completely untrue. We are here. We are here in terms of security. We are here in terms of trade and commerce, and we are here in terms of friendship. And that's why I've come through these three countries and spent almost 3 weeks in this part of the world. Secondly, we are at Commerce really trying to develop a lot of programs to increase trade from the United States to the ASEAN region and vice versa, products coming from the ASEAN region to the United States. We have programs, I won't go into all their names, but one is called Access Asia, another is called Select USA for people from ASEAN and all over the world to come to the United States and look at investing in the United States. And finally, I think, I don't want to go into great detail, but there's a great concern in the ASEAN region about China and whether China is going to be the only player and have enormous influence and undue influence. And they want the United States to be here to be able to have another major player here to some degree to offset what China is doing. That's very similar to what I saw in Africa. When I was there a couple months ago, I went to Ethiopia, Kenya, Cote d'Ivoire, and Ghana. Exactly the same concerns. So the United States realizes that not only do we want to support Africa, ASEAN, other parts of the world, but it's become kind of a competitive issue when we are standing up and dealing with that competition. And on that playing field.
Right. Again, there are lots of questions. I want to come back to them too, but I do want to give the audience an opportunity to ask a question. We have a very distinguished panel here. If we could, if anybody has a question, want to raise your hand.
One right here.
As we could maybe raise the lights. Here, gentleman here in the front. If you could identify yourself as well, please, and there's a microphone. Thank you.
I'm Steve Oken. I'm with McClarty Associates, but also the chair of the AmCham TPP task force here in Singapore. And what businesses need in the 21st century are multilateral rules-based trading systems so that we can engage in the global supply chain. Yet, you know, Mr. Secretary, this administration seems hostile to that concept. The first, third day, the Trump administration pulls out of the TPP. The negotiations you've talked about, the U.S.-Korea FTA, what did that do? That extended tariffs on Korean light trucks to protect U.S. auto manufacturers. All the NAFTA negotiations are to protect the U.S. industry at home. When will the U.S. start to engage on a multilateral rules-based system, which is what we really need out here, as opposed to focusing on these bilateral agreements?
You saw my introduction.
Hey, you gotta...
Well, I realize that TPP is very popular in Singapore. We have a free trade agreement with Singapore. We've had it since 2003. It's been tremendously beneficial to Singapore and to the United States. We have said after we left TPP that we would encourage bilateral negotiations with any of the TPP 11. And we have been engaging with that. And the agreement with Mexico is really the first one of those that has been very, very successful. That agreement is beneficial to Mexico and to the United States. I think it will raise wages and standards of living in Mexico, and it will be helpful to the United States. Just that one issue I discussed in terms of the protection of biologics data for 10 years, that's an enormous step for pharmaceutical companies and for public health so that people can invest in these critical new drugs that are needed everywhere in the world. On the issue of multilateralism, I spent a lot of time negotiating at the WTO, and I agree completely with the views of the President and Secretary Ross that our strength as a nation is a very large market, enormous creativity, enormous manufacturing and service success. But when we're in a room with 170 other countries, or 169, we're the 170th, it's very hard to negotiate and get good deals because our influence is totally watered down. So we have just felt that we need to approach and deal with our trading partners on a bilateral basis. And then just one quick point. I think this is proven completely by that issue of data protection for biologics. In the TPP, everybody agreed on probably a 10 or even longer period of protection, but there was one country that said, no, we can't do it. We have some problem in our legislation. So the entire intellectual property protection relating to pharmaceuticals, we had to agree to a much shorter period of coverage because just one country wanted to undercut everybody else's negotiating position. So that kind of multilateral agreement is not in the interests of the United States right now. And we are going to negotiate on a bilateral basis for the foreseeable future.
Thank you, Secretary. More questions, please. I'm having difficulty seeing here. If you don't, I've got plenty of questions myself. Christine, I'm going to come to you, and also maybe to Secretary Gutierrez, and picking up on something that you said, Secretary. You know, that companies should get out there and proselytize for free trade and say, you know, free trade is a good thing and trade is a good thing and it's good and we can compete in the world and all that kind of stuff. And yet people, I think, and again, Frank can speak to this more than I can, a lot of people do think that that's all very well in theory, but in practice, the way the world trade system operates, especially for a lot of American workers, is unfair. It's not fair, as the president says, that China imposes a 25% tariff on U.S. cars, and the U.S. imposes a 2.5% tariff. Now, those numbers, I know, are subject to debate, but Chinese tariffs on a number of products are higher. It's not fair that when U.S. companies try and do business in China, they're subject to all kinds of restrictions and requirements from the Chinese government that Chinese companies are not subjected to in the United States. It's not fair that the Chinese government doesn't do anything really, let's be honest, to protect against intellectual property theft and abuse, whereas in the United States, it has an extraordinary system. We have an extraordinary system of patent protection and legal structures that stop people doing that. Trade is fine in principle, but in practice, the way these deals have worked over the last 25 years, it's not fair. It's not fair these are one-sided deals, one-sided arrangements, which don't help the United States and help other countries. How do you respond to that?
I think there is no disagreement in terms of criticisms of China and intellectual property theft, practicing coercive economic diplomacy, or what some call predatory development finance modeling. I don't think there's any dispute, but to use trade tariffs as a lever to address these issues, there's a huge question mark. We go back to an example, 2009, under the Obama administration, 35% tariff was slapped on Chinese exports of tires. Chinese retaliated with tariffs on chicken parts, right? It didn't last that long, 3 years, and the tariffs disappeared. The fundamental restructuring of economies and economic life renders what is happening now really, on some level, meaningless. And I don't mean to minimize the security aspects of it. We should spend much more time, going back to Frank's, how do you communicate to the working classes, right, who are gradually, progressively, and I put in quotation marks, marginalized, disenfranchised from the creation of wealth, from participating in productive economy. Our understanding of productive economy has gone way beyond manufacturing. We must be prepared for that. So for the captains of industry in this room, for the heads of philanthropic organizations, we have to think through public-private partnerships, right? To be engaged in the communities in which you are active, whether it's here in this region or back in the US. 3, how does, and I speak about higher education because that's what I'm in, right? How do we prepare, or how can higher education institutions prepare the younger generations of engaged citizens for different notions of work, some of which we have yet to imagine? How do we harness the human imagination for that? I'm taking the longer term view, right? The shorter term view is, oops, we're in trouble, it's tit for tat. We know that trade wars don't really work. Yes, we can move production back. Look at Carrier. Carrier promised not to move production overseas to Mexico, right? Shortly after the election. What happened a few months later? Jobs started to move. How do we prepare? Not the elite, and you're right, Frank, for those of us in this room, we are considered the global elite. How do you prepare the middle classes and the working classes, or middle income, lower income, for a completely different world of work? And I'm not even going to invoke the moral imperative. I will invoke the business imperative, because it disrupts the everyday conduct of business.
Thank you, Christine. Secretary.
Thank you. Interesting that during the Bush administration, we did primarily bilaterals. And we're highly criticized because back then the Holy Grail was the WTO Doha massive worldwide agreement, which became, frankly, an impossibility. But I wonder if we are able to avoid multilateralism. So we talk about potentially doing some kind of a deal with the EU. That's multilateral. In a non-multilateral setting, today we have GDPR in the European Union to regulate data transfer, to regulate information. India has its own program, its own set of rules. And of course, China is looking at 2025. So if we reject multilateralism totally, my concern is that we're going to see the world splinter. So not that I'm advocating for a WTO worldwide agreement, but I don't think we should discard multilateralism in some way. I think we need to be talking about worldwide rules for data transfer, worldwide rules for cybersecurity, worldwide rules for how are we going to deal with these new technologies. That's multilateralism. So I think in the future it will be more difficult to avoid. And again, I have some sympathy for the empathy for bilaterals, because that's what we did.
Mr. Secretary, is multilateralism dead when it comes to trade arrangements?
No, I don't think it's dead. I think maybe we needed to rebalance a little bit and try to make sure that, at least in this phase of negotiations, the United States uses the full ability and strength of its market and its negotiating ability. I've just seen many agreements that were scuttled by one country. At the WTO, every agreement has to be by consensus. And when we were in the last phases of the Doha round, and we could have closed the Doha round, that might have been good, it might have been bad. That was a while ago now, but this was before the Trump administration. Two countries basically stood up and ended that agreement. One was India and one was China, with different concerns. But we were able to accomplish an agreement with all the other members. So it just gets very frustrating to be working in this multilateral format, and we feel right now the best approach is bilateral, but I'm not sure that's forever. We are looking at the NAFTA agreement, which would be with three countries, and as Carlos says, if we do something with the EU, that by its very nature is multilateral. Whenever you negotiate with the EU, at some point they say, well, we could have an agreement on X, Y, or Z, but Italy doesn't agree. They go to their state. So I started saying, well, we can have an agreement on X, Y, or Z, but I can't get Missouri on board. So, even we have multilateral parties in the United States.
True. More questions, please, from the audience. There's an opportunity to ask this very distinguished panel. I'm trying to see if there's anybody.
Right here.
Anybody else? Oh, yes, gentleman at the front, please. There's a microphone, and if you would identify yourself, please.
My name is Ralph Simon from Mobilium Global. We are about to launch a major initiative which we call the Education Moonshot. It starts in Silicon Valley with Stanford University and one of the great educational icons from America by the name of Esther Wojcicki. What we're doing is developing this moonshot to take notion exactly of Mrs. Chin said about changing nature of jobs and skills for being able to get not only learners and students, but companies and governments to be involved in the development of new skills for the 21st century technological era. So far, the only country in Asia that has stepped up to the plate to want to do something has been Indonesia. This is basically going to be a whole new way of teaching kids about journalism as a tool for skills in business. And secondly, taking a model that was developed in France by a well-known tech investor and success story with schools called 42 that are coding schools. We need to get the support of the United States and the international countries here in Asia to support coding and these new skills, because this, we believe, as you pointed out, is absolutely essential. Any comments on that?
Yes, and it is not just teaching, anticipating teaching new skills. we have to find ways in which we harness technology to work for us as opposed to us working for technology. That the preparation of the younger generation to live in a different kind of world, different notions of work, must be accompanied by really encouraging them, mentoring them, shepherding them to focus on the human dimension, the face-to-face interpersonal interactions. I'll give you an example. Before I flew out to Southeast Asia, I had dinner with a friend in a restaurant, and I watched this family, mother, father, and 2 kids. Each had a cell phone, and I counted how many words they exchanged amongst themselves at the dinner table. It was less than 10. They ordered their food, each one got on it, right? That is the challenging part of technology. We live in a world that is integrated in terms of the economy, and that's why it's very hard to de-link. But it is not just integrated, it's not just integrated in terms of the economic dimension, but that different peoples, different cultures, different worldviews, different ways of making sense of the world now come into, right? So there are opportunities for cooperation, collaboration. There are opportunities for conflict and dispute. I don't think we've done a good job in terms of preparing the younger generation. That has to go hand in hand.
It's an excellent
Sorry,
point.
Carl.
I just want to say, sir, I think you're right, right on track. That what we see, the trend that we see is a movement from diplomas to skills. And our diplomas, are very general, and you come out with general education, but not with the skills that you need to thrive in the 21st century. So thank you for what you're doing.
Can I just...
Yeah, quickly, Frank.
Language,
Yeah, please.
You call it education moonshot. That's 40 years old. If you're 50 years old, you don't even know what that really means. You were too young. Can you please come up with language that is much more inspiring for the people that you wish to touch?
Got a bit of free public relations advice there.
No, I assure you.
Who says you can't learn anything from these?
Nothing is free.
Excellent. Look,
Excellent.
very
really?
very helpful. Very helpful. Thank you, Frank. Thank you very much indeed. We are almost out of time, but I do want to allow our panelists each a very brief moment of summing up, final observations, and I'll go in, reverse order from how we started. So that means you, Frank, firstly.
You guys got to get your language right. And you got to be in tune with the people that you're wishing to talk to. And I think that's one of the greatest challenges in trade right now, is that there are very good arguments, but no one adopts them. And I'm going to give you the two that matter most to the public: accountability and enforceability. That's what they want. That's what makes them angry. And for those of you who hate this trade war and want America, you call it American trade, not global trade, not international trade. For those of you who are American, when you call it American trade, then they believe that it's about them rather than helping somebody else. Just get the words right.
Thank you. Christine?
Talk about 6 degrees of separation. I'm switching gears a bit. I'm the Dean of the School of International Service at American University. Carlos's right-hand woman is an alumnus of of my school. Gil lives down the road from American University. Frank used to teach at American University. Just giving it a plug. 6 degrees of separation. It's been a pleasure. This is really important, the conversations that we've had. And I'm not pessimistic, because I think there is a role, there are major roles for those of us who are educators as to how we prepare the younger generation to lead in a world that is really, really different from the world in which we inherited. Thank you
very much, Christine.
I would urge our leaders to start talking about what kind of a world do we want to see? What kind of a world are we trying to build, and work towards that? Right now, we're stuck in the current moment. without having a view of how this is all going to shake out and how we're going to put it all back together, whether it's a new system or it's an improved current system. But I think that's the strategic question that we have to address. Second, I would just say I think a lot of these negotiations should take place in private. I think there's too much negotiating in public, and it's hard to humiliate someone to the negotiating table.
Secretary Kaplan?
Just very briefly, we have about 2,300 people in the International Trade Administration that I'm in charge of, and I guess I would challenge Christina a little. The younger people are so amazingly talented, digitally conversant, and so committed that, you know, I'm not sure we're not training people the right way. I think they are absolutely ready for whatever is going to come next. The trade work we're doing, both in terms of national security and the 232 cases, and dealing with advanced manufacturing and making sure America has a place in that world, really is for that generation. We have said, look, we've got to make sure that the American dream we lived with will continue on, and we don't want to be, you know, behind the eight ball. We want to be right there at the cutting edge. I know we need skills for manufacturing. We're also devoting resources to that. But we want in the trade world to make sure that this next generation has the same benefits that the people on this stage have had.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. The topic for discussion was tweets and trade. As I said, I'm not sure if you've been tweeting. If you have, I hope you've given a fair account of what you've heard, but I want to thank you very much indeed for being here, for being part of this discussion. But most of all, obviously, I want to thank our panelists for such a really interesting and really provocative discourse. Thank you very much indeed.